All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thanks to my colleague for being here with me today. Right now, we are facing an unprecedented crisis that has led to millions of Americans at risk of housing instability and homelessness. As you know, the housing crisis didn't begin with the coronavirus crisis. It's exacerbated the problem. In my home state of Minnesota, nearly 8,000 people faced homelessness on a given night in 2019. In North Minneapolis, nearly half of all renters have experienced eviction in the last 3 years. Hundreds of thousands are living in temporary shelters or transitional housing, most of them caught in a perpetual cycle of housing insecurity. While the American Rescue Plan extends the national rent moratorium, but this is not a long-term solution. The people across this country will be forced to pay tens of thousands of dollars in back rent when this ends. In some cases, local governments are allowing evictions to continue despite the moratorium. In other cases, landlords are going bankrupt due to the lack of income. The solution is to cancel rent and mortgage payments. I introduced the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act, which would permanently cancel all rent and mortgage payments until April 2022. The legislation would also create a home lenders relief fund to fully compensate landlords and mortgage holders. It would also establish an optional fund that would help expand affordable housing even after the pandemic ends. I know you all know how important this legislation is. So let's keep up the fight, and I can't wait to fight alongside you.
First of all, let me thank Congresswoman Omar for continuing to fight for the people. Also, let me just say you continue to introduce legislation to give people hope, regarding the real possibilities of equity and justice, and this is just another example of that. And so I'm so proud to be here alongside with so many of my colleagues fighting for housing justice. Yes, we've struggled through a year of gross neglect. People have suffered, died, lost their jobs and businesses. Families are living on the edge, and many more have become unhoused and unsheltered. According to data collected by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, an estimated 13 million adults living in rental housing, that's nearly 1 in 5 adult renters, were not caught up on their rent. And we know that this pandemic has disproportionately impacted communities of color, and housing instability is no exception. Communities of color were far more likely to report that their household was not caught up on rent. That's 33% of African American renters, 20% of Latinx renters, 16% of AAPI renters, and 22% for American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, compared to 13% of white renters. So housing justice is really a racial justice issue, and we can't allow families to suffer any longer. So I'm so proud to be able to work with Representative Omar and all of our colleagues on the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act, because families should not have to worry about making ends meet and then left to be dealt with left to be dealing with long-term financial burdens after this pandemic is finally over and when our economy begins to recover. So this bill would constitute full payment forgiveness with no accumulation debt for homeowners or renters, and no negative, which is so important about this bill, no negative impact on their credit rental history. Also, it creates this relief fund for landlords and mortgage holders to cover losses from canceled payments. It creates an optional fund to fully finance the purchase of private rental properties by nonprofits, public housing authorities, cooperatives, community land trusts, and state and local governments in order to increase the availability of affordable housing during this downturn. So we must do more. Housing issues have been a priority for me personally since, way back in the day. I was served on the Financial Services Committee, Subcommittee on Housing when I first came to Congress for about 10 years. Also, prior to coming to Congress, I was chair of the Housing and Land Use Committee in the California State Senate. And I know that home ownership is one of the most efficient ways toward generational wealth, and that it's a right that black and brown people have been denied for centuries. But also, let me be clear that housing is a basic human right regardless of whether you're a renter or a homeowner. In the wealthiest country in the world, there's no excuse, so we must get it done, and we must get it done now. So thank you again, Congresswoman Omar, for doing this bill, for pushing the envelope, and for making sure that we recognize, especially during this pandemic, that housing is a basic human right. Thank you again.
Thank you, Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Next, we're going to have one of Massachusetts' finest, a champion of the people, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley.
Thank you, Representative. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. You know, I'm very proud to stand alongside Congresswoman Omar and my colleagues, my brothers and sisters in service, to reintroduce the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act. This is bold legislation that meets the moment and affirms housing as the fundamental human right that it is. Yesterday, I was proud to support the American Rescue Plan to send critical relief to the millions of workers and families struggling to make ends meet during this pandemic. But make no mistake, our work is not over, and it must continue. The economic impact of this pandemic is worsening daily, and the threat of eviction and homelessness looms large for families in Massachusetts and all across this country. Housing is a critical determinant of health, of economic opportunity and social mobility, and we have a moral, I want to underscore the moral and collective responsibility here, that we are having to fight for this and affirm the need to keep people housed in the midst of a pandemic. And prior to the pandemic, there were 3.7 million eviction filings a year. I know the trauma of being met with an eviction notice on your door. This is about public health. This is about social justice. This is about economic justice. But this is also about our basic morality in centering the humanity of people to meet their most basic needs. Now, we have been calling for the cancellation of rent and mortgage payments for the duration of this public health emergency since the early days of the pandemic. Our legislation would move us towards an America where no person or family is forced to make the unconscionable choice between putting food on the table and keeping a roof over their head. For too long, our nation has overlooked the needs of our most vulnerable and marginalized communities, our unhoused, our frontline workers, those without the cushion of generational wealth, including our black and brown communities. Now, the 2008 financial crisis was a Great Depression-level event for black Americans, wiping out decades of gains in black home ownership, which has now fallen to its lowest rate since the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Today, our families and workers nationwide are staring down an unprecedented financial cliff. Many have been left unemployed, while rent and mortgage payments continue to pile up. The bills have not stopped coming. We cannot afford to repeat the mistakes of the past. The Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act would help ensure tenants and mortgage holders don't have a backlog of payments once this crisis is over. It would forgive all rental debt to ensure that the credit scores of hard-hit families are not forever tarnished. Congress must pass this bill before it is too late. Our communities need this. Our communities deserve this. Thank you once again, Congresswoman Omar, for your leadership and your partnership on this critical legislation and so many other issues.
Thank you, Congresswoman Pressley. Next, we have a new addition to Congress, Congresswoman Cori Bush, who, like myself, knows what it means to be housing insecure and homeless. Congresswoman Cori Bush.
Oh, good afternoon, and thank you to Congresswoman Omar for this fundamental work. It's necessary to stand up, and this is a fight that we all should be a part of. You know, for me, the thought of overwhelming rent payments brings back painful memories. I'm standing here in Congress as someone who has been unhoused with 2 children living out of a car, only to be let down and left out by our government. I'm here in Congress to stand up for our community members who have been currently or who have been in the past unhoused. I'm here to stand up for those who have the least. We cannot take shelter for granted when over 500,000 of our neighbors are unhoused on any given night. How do we sleep when we know that many people are unhoused? This was an existential crisis of cruelty in the richest country in the world before the pandemic. The pandemic has made this situation far worse and far deadlier, with the rent and utility burdens rapidly increasing at a time when corporate profits are soaring. Corporate profits are soaring. This legislation will provide the people with the relief that they need. Today, I'm proud to stand here. I'm proud to join with Congressman Omar and my colleagues as we work on this, fighting for the basic right of shelter. We're talking about shelter for people. This is something that should not be negotiable. This is something that we should not have to have a discussion about. We are laying the groundwork for a future where housing is a fundamental right. When you come home and you walk up to your door and you have to think about, is there an eviction notice on my door? When you wake up in the morning wondering if today is the day, and you know if today is the day that you got to go buy trash bags because you don't have enough money even to put your stuff in boxes to move, this is our work. So we thank the Congresswoman and all of our colleagues for standing up for all the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bush. Next, we have Congressman from the great state of Illinois, Garcia.
Thank you. As a member of Congress and a member of the Financial Services Committee, I'm proud to join Representative Omar and my colleagues in the call to cancel rent and to cancel mortgages. Why? Because housing is a human right. And it's sickening that we can't agree on something as basic as that. Look, I represent a working class, majority Latino district in Chicago, and most of my constituents are renters. The pandemic hit my community hard. A quarter of Latinos in Illinois don't know whether they'll be able to make rent payment or not next month. But this crisis is not new. Housing has been a concern in my community even before the pandemic. We've had more than a decade of gentrification and displacement in neighborhoods on the north and the south sides of my district. We've got to stop evictions and foreclosures and plan for a future of affordable, stable neighborhoods. Community before profits. Let's give working families the break that they desperately need. Support this bill, make it the law of the land. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Garcia. Next, we have Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib.
Thank you so much to the leadership of Representative Omar and for her continuation to making sure that we're not done yet. The American Rescue Plan was very much needed, but it also was done in very much a delay until we were able to have someone in the White House that supported moving very quickly and helping our families. Yesterday in Michigan, we observed an anniversary of the first known COVID case being announced. We lost loved ones and our lives have been forever changed. To this day, people are still dealing with the health and economic pain that the pandemic has caused. It is really important that we understand that moratoriums are good, but they're going to end. And without payment and debt cancellation, we are kicking a crisis down the road. Vaccinations are critical, and we're glad that we funded $20 billion to expand distribution. But those vaccinations are not going to pay the bills that we're not able to pay for during this past year. So we have to understand we need to continue to support initiatives and bold policies like this. I'm proud to stand here in support of a very important legislation. And as somebody that represents the third poorest congressional district in the country that has been directly harmed from this pandemic, we were already in survivor mode prior to it, and now it's gotten much worse. As I push for shots in the arms, I'm also asking the administration, the leadership of the House and the Senate to understand we also need bold economic crisis, to address the bold, to support bold economic initiatives like this to help our families in need. Thank you so much. And again, thank you so much to Representative Omar for her continued leadership on this issue.
Thank you, Congresswoman Tlaib. Next, we have Representative Mark Bocan.
Thank you very much, Representative Omar, not just for introducing this important legislation about something as vital as shelter, but for having an outdoor press conference on a day that's neither in the chilly 30s or the humid 90s, but the perfect 70s. I hope the same good fortune happens to your bill. Yesterday, the House passed a crucial relief package that puts money in people's pockets, expands vaccine distribution, gives schools the resources they need, and helps workers and small businesses survive. But just like yesterday's bill doesn't solve every problem Americans are facing, our work is far from over. Over 11 million families, nearly 10% of all U.S. households, are at risk of eviction and foreclosure, with rates highest among Black and Latinx households. More homeowners are behind on their mortgages now than at any time in over a decade. For most people, providing for food and shelter are their most basic needs, and no one should have to sacrifice either. This legislation ensures that working families won't have to choose between putting food on their table or a roof over their head. I am proud to co-sponsor Representative Omar's bill to prevent millions of families from getting evicted or losing their homes. The American people's safety must continue to be our top priority.
Thank you. And now we will conclude with Congressman Jamal Bowen and Congresswoman Gomez.
Thank you, Congresswoman Omar, for your continued visionary leadership. You know, our nation is riddled with economic inequality. And our district, if it were a nation, would have the 8th worst economic inequality in the country, in the world, quite frankly. There are pockets of my district where the poverty rate is as high as 30%. And even prior to the pandemic, 50% of those who live in my district were rent burdened, and 30% were severely rent burdened, which means they paid 50% of their salary toward rent. And this bill is important to me on a personal level because throughout this pandemic, during the pandemic, I had to, ask for forgiveness from my rent during this time. And I had to push it back to the end of my mortgage. And at the end of my mortgage, that bill is going to come due. And who knows if I will be able to afford it at that time. In my district represents Westchester County, New York. And Yonkers, New York is a part of Westchester County. And 50% of the homeless population in Westchester County resides in Yonkers. So this is an up close and personal situation for me and for our district. And it's finally the time for us to center those who are most vulnerable in our society, center those who are continue to be housing insecure, and make sure we give them a leg up and provide them the support that they need. And canceling rent and mortgage will do just that and allow them to invest in themselves and in their families in a way that they've never been able to do before. Housing is health care. Housing is a human right. It should not be a commodity. And I am proud to support Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Bowen. Oh, I already.
Thank you. First, let me thank Congresswoman Omar for reintroducing this bill. I actually just signed on for this introduction. I became a co-sponsor this year. I was supporting, and I do support what we did in the American Rescue Plan, which was a big deal. We got, we got another $25 billion for rent relief, $5 billion for dealing with individuals who are currently experiencing homelessness, and then we even got, I think it was about $30 billion in the December appropriations package for rent relief. Huge deal. I represent LA, and I have one of the largest homeless populations anywhere in the country. And we have people struggling, and we have people suffering. And if we don't do something that's bold, it's going to be even more people to come. Right now, it's projected that homeless individuals living on the streets of LA County will increase 89% in the next 4 years, right? And there also means that people are going to be struggling to stay in their apartments, in their homes. So what we're trying to say is that this is a national crisis that needs a national response. And if you think it's just limited to the big cities, people are wrong. Sherrod Brown just recently said that the housing costs, the cost of buying a home in Ohio are going up too much. And what that happens is when you see a rise in housing costs where people can't buy into the market, then you're going to see a rise in rents. So this crisis will spread no matter what people think. And if we don't deal with it now. So I'm just asking everybody to make housing and homelessness and the rising rents and the evictions that are going to be coming a national priority. And I believe that this bill does just that. So I want to just thank Congresswoman Ilhan Omar once again for introducing this bill.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Usually this place is the people's house, and we have press conferences with people's voices included, but because of the predicaments that we have at the moment, we don't have those, and so we will submit written testimonies of the people who would have joined us for this press conference, who are directly being impacted by the housing crisis that we are faced with right now. That concludes our press conference. We can take one or two questions. Are you guys okay?
I'll ask something.
Okay.
How do you get moderates to like agree with this or to sign on to something like that?
Yeah. I think it's important, right, like to make sure that this isn't seen as a progressive bill. This is a bill that we consider to be the people's bill. It came out of the rent strikes that were happening throughout our country as the pandemic hit. People were formulating ideas of what it would take for us to address this crisis. People understand that currently we have 12 million people in our country that ultimately have about an average of $6,000 in back rent. People know that the rental assistance that we are providing through, the congressional legislation that we've done during COVID, the work that is trickling down in our state houses and municipalities, it's not going to address the crisis. It's nibbling at the edges of the problem that we have. We are ultimately going to have a real housing collapse. And so, we're going to continue to have conversations with our colleagues and make sure they understand the gravity of the housing crisis that exists and hopefully get them on board in pushing for this legislation.
Was this an effort you tried to get in the last public package? And I'm curious what roadblocks you came
It was not. We've just introduced it today, so it didn't make it in time for that for the conversation in the American Rescue Package, and so we're hoping to have it be part of the conversation as we draft, next packages.
Because there's going to be another package.
Because there's going to be another package.
What's the feeling among progressives? Is there any kind of sense of frustration after seeing this battle between moderates and the Republicans in the Senate stripping away some of the progressive priorities in the first bill that was passed? What does that spell for issues like immigration and gun control and some of the issues that
Do you wanna-
we're going to
Yeah, I think it's somewhat overblown, to be honest with you. A good example, how do you get moderates involved in this issue? Is that when they start realizing that it's going to have an impact not only on the renters, but also on the people who own those properties, right? The small landlords that use that income to start businesses. And when one of the things they do in order to refinance, one of the main questions they ask is, did your tenants miss any payments? That will start increasing the interest rates that they get on their mortgages, on their loans, and it's going to have a ripple effect through the economy. And when they start seeing that, you bring them in more. Additionally, sometimes progressive ideas sound radical at first, you can't implement them a little bit later, and then they become mainstream. The child tax credit, right, is basically a universal basic guaranteed income for children that's been advocated for years. But we were able to do it now with hardly ever a peep that will guarantee advance payments of $250 to $300 per child in advance payments, no matter what, if people are working or not, below a certain income threshold. That is revolutionary. They just didn't know it because it came up on them, right, over the years. So these progressive ideas often become mainstream, and they become, I would say, into the mainstream consciousness of the Democratic Party and the country. So we didn't get the increase in the minimum wage, but we're going to keep fighting for it, and I still do think we have a chance. Even Manchin was saying, well, I wasn't against raising the minimum wage, it was just how much and how quickly, right? So I think we didn't get everything we wanted, but it is still a very progressive rescue plan, one more so than the Republicans, right? If you look, tax, because I'm on the Ways and Means Committee, it says there's going to be a 20% boost for the 20% lowest income earners in this country, and a 0% boost in income for the top 1% of this country. That's the difference between a Republican rescue plan and a Democratic rescue plan.
Are you seeing any Republicans start to, share some ideas with progressives and talk about some of these things? Is there any headway there?
When it comes to the issue of equity, so is something that we're starting to have a lot more conversations. But equity is not just a black or a Latino or urban thing. It's also a rural thing, right? People that are left behind are oftentimes the poor whites that are in the rural areas that the programs don't work for them because they don't have internet, they don't have Wi-Fi, they don't have a community college near them, right? So they're starting to have those conversations. We had a good hearing on HPOGs, basically opportunity grants for healthcare workers, and I was having a conversation with Carol Miller from West Virginia, and her and I are as far as we can get on the political spectrum, but she knows that in order for her people to do better, we need these kind of programs that are targeted to the working class and to the lower income individuals in this country.
Jamal, did you have anything?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Did you have any other questions? Yeah.
Congressman, what's the extent of your communication on this bill with the Senate then?
It's been really good, actually. I think the initial conversations we've had with some senators is what gave us the energy and the excitement to reintroduce the legislation. There is a lot of conversations about what pieces of the bill that could be incorporated into maybe the housing or an infrastructure bill, or maybe another COVID relief package.
Have you spoken to any of the Senate moderates?
can't tell you what senators I've spoken to, but we've spoken to senators.
What's the conversation been like with the White House? And you know that the White House has done a decent amount of reaching out to Republicans and some moderates to try to get these bills through, but are progressives having conversations with the White House?
We have, and I think to Congressman Gomez's earlier point, the package that arrived in the House was as progressive as it could be because of the conversations the progressives were having with the White House to say, this is, a package that we will accept. This is a package that you can have our votes on and our support, and we will, have your back on it. If you send anything less, then it might not work out. And I think that early signal and those early conversations is the reason that we send one of the most progressive pieces of legislation to the Senate. And it still remains to be one of the most progressive pieces of legislation. And, I think the things that were taken out or we lost are minimal to what was gained by the Senate moderates and Republicans who were opposed to it. So ultimately, I think, there will be a recognition that the policies that we are advocating for are not about being progressive, moderate, or Republican. It's about what the people of this country need and what they have been advocating for. This package enjoys 70 plus approval with the American people. Nearly 60% of Republicans outside of the Capitol support it. Nearly 90% of Democrats outside of the Capitol support it. And I think that's the conversation that we need to continue to have, is to remind people that the center you're looking for is not the center of where the Washington elites and the Beltway is where the center of America is. And the center of America seems to be very progressive in the policies that they want implemented by this president. So thank you all.
Thank you.